In the last session that we looked at, we primarily focused until Revelation chapter 13, verse 10. However, I thought I will start with chapter 13 in a short, concise manner so that there will be a continuity which we will get as we look at it. Now, we can see that in Revelation chapter 13, by taking Daniel 7 and that imagery of Daniel's four beasts, and over here in this first part of chapter 13, it is comprised as one beast that is rising from the sea. And this beast is not just representing, though in the initial audience it is representing Roman Empire, but in the larger reality, it is opposing every god opposing empire. And we can see that this imagery of the wounded yet restored head, that we can find in chapter 13, where it says here is a wounded head but restored, a sort of like a understanding of that point of time that Nero, who died having a wound in his head, might come back to life. Now, obviously, this is not just talking about Nero or taking the myth of Nero, but it's kind of taking the understanding of anybody who is opposing God, right? Or portraying the beast as a recurring Nero-like figure, somebody who is an anti-God, somebody who is taking the anti-God, picture sort of a thing. So this is not necessarily a literal Nero that we can find here, but somebody who's like Nero, somebody who's opposing God's people and persecuting God's people. The beast's apparent resurrection is a counterfeit of Christ's resurrection, deliberately contrasting the beast with the lamb. So this is now the two parallel that we are going to see. We are going to see on one side the Lamb of God and on the other side the beast. And this fight, this revolt, and this contrast is going to be clearly there. Imperial claims to divine authority, especially that under Domitian, are exposed as blasphemous and imitations of God's rule. So they're taking the power and positions of God's rule, but they are definitely not God, or they are not going to remain as God's people forever, or godlike power forever. The beast's war against the saints is ultimately spiritual, targeting God's people and calling them to compromise and idolatry. So the challenge here is eventually they should fail God's people, and the God's people should come back into a space of compromise. And that is what here the dragon, the beast, is trying to do. And that is what the beast is trying to get from the people of God, taking people who are, in the way of God, in the city of God, and making them dragons or beastly people. Despite its terrifying power, now this is where the hope is. Despite its terrifying power, the beast's authority is limited, temporary, and only given by the divine permission. So every power that is there, right? Now we can find that this power is limited and it is temporary. It's only for a time being because it is operated under God's guidance. It is operated only with the permission of God, and hence we can find that it is very clearly calling the people of God, don't fall for idolatry, but rather resist the evil. That's what we can read towards the end of chapter 13, verse 10. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. So the call here is to be faithful. So this is the dragon that we can find from the sea, the beast from the sea. But then the second part of it, we can find the beast that is coming from the earth, right? The second beast is coming out of the earth from verse 11 onwards. Now, again, there is resemblance, right? Two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Now, it's again a deceptive religious agent that is promoting the allegiance to the first beast. So what is happening here is this second beast is promoting, speaking, and kind of persuading people to follow the first beast. Many interpreters see it as the imperial cult or its priesthood, especially since it rises from the earth rather than the sea. So what we can find is Rome was controlled in different spaces. Rome did not come directly rule over every place that it had the governance. It had its own way and systems of ruling. So here we can find that this is somehow representing how the rule over the earth, how they are ruling over every sphere of the earth in different ways. And what is happening is it's like a parody to the lamb. The lamb, the original lamb who is slain, who is Christ, is now demeaned or is not valued, but instead a deliberate counterfeit of Christ-like imagery is coming out here. Now look at it. Because what is it doing? Just like how Jesus performed many signs, verse 13 says, this beast performed many signs, and even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in view of the people. So there is a mighty power that we can kind of see with the second beast. So what we can get over here is that it is trying to become, or it is trying to take the position of Christ. But what it is revealed by its speech. The voice is revealing its true nature, that it speaks as the dragon. So who is it really? It is the dragon. It is the beast. Now, the beast's primary role is enforced worship. And that's what the Rome used to do, isn't it? They were forcing the people to worship the kings, obviously echoing the imperial practices, where emperors like Domitian were calling people, just like how at the time of Daniel, and here is the notion where the king had to be worshipped, just like that, the emperor is called for worship. However, the challenge here is, unlike Daniel's friends who were saved from death, many here are not saved from death. In fact, they are giving up their life and they are killed, or they are taken, or their life are taken, as we can find it. So here the mark warns against divided allegiance. So the whole idea here is, now especially when we look from the later verses, for example, if you look from verse 15, the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image be killed. So allegiance or loyalty or worship to the beast is what is enforced upon people. It forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. Now, there is a mark that, or there is a mark that this people have to take upon themselves, and this mark is kind of representing as the mark of the beast that we can find towards chapter 13 verse 18. Now, what is this all about? Now, the mark is not about finding, look around, find any serial numbers here and there, and you will be able to find 666 somewhere, or you take a can of some juice and over there you find some 666. That is not what this is talking about. Now, this is primarily talking about allegiance, right? There are different ways how people have interpreted it, and we'll come to that. But one of the interesting thing here is the beast is performing signs and wonders, function as a parodic miracle, imitating the divine act. So just like what Jesus was doing, here is the beast also doing miraculous act. A good indicator that we should not fall prey to authentic men and women of God just because they are doing some great miracles. I think we have to be very careful in understanding something like that. Here, imitating is just like how Jesus is warning in Matthew 24, that he never knew them. Matthew 7, right, that they have no idea who they truly are. And the strategy here is imitation. There is no originality. There is no trueness. There is no authenticity of who they are. So the mark of the beast, especially with the next chapter, looking at the number 144,000, we can understand that this is talking about allegiance. It is about participation in either in an idolatrous system or participation in God's family. It contrasts with God's seal on his people. So in chapter 7, we saw that God has sealed his people. Now, seal meant authorship. Seal meant that they are the people of God. And function that they don't have the mark of the slave, but rather they carry the mark of God over them. Especially in John's world, in the first century context, we can find that economic survival depended on imperial worship. And if you refuse to worship, that means you might not be able to buy rice, you might not be able to buy, things that is essential for our lives. And that's why the mark that we can find over here is more to do with our loyalty, even when it truly cost. So what is actually that we can find in, Revelation 13 is not to look at the number of Obama's car or some other, United Nations or United States or European Union. Or, that is not the agenda of why we have Revelation chapter 13. But it's about don't fall prey to imperial worship or anything that claim of allegiance onto our life, and that we have to be very careful. So then what is this 666? Now again, chapter 13, in the initial section, we saw how there was a lot of interesting aspect of talking about Nero out there. So 666, to some extent, now please understand that these are scholarly inputs that are come over there. Now 666, the way how it is put is through a phenomenon called gematria. Now, gematria is where Hebrew alphabet, all the letters in the Hebrew alphabet are given numerical representations. So we can find that if you actually calculate Neron Kaiser in its Hebrew form, right, in its Hebrew form, we get the number 666. Now, this is mostly accepted in the Christian scholarship today. Now, nobody is claiming that 666 is primarily talking about Nero alone, but it is kind of telling a Nero-like antichrist figure. Now, please understand, I'm not using antichrist in the sense of how we commonly assume it to be. Antichrist is somebody who's opposing Christ, and that's what Nero did. That's what Emperor Domitian did. That is what many of these emperors and people, Babylon, tried to do. And here Neron was that person who stood as opposing Christ, anti-Christ. And hence, they're using this image. So people there were aware of gematria. Now, David, the name David, if you calculate David, right, Dalet, Vav, and Dalet, we get the number 14. Now, like that, these numerical representation kind of added up. Now, almost every Hebrew, name had this sort of an understanding. So what is it kind of showing is, at a symbolic level, it represents falling short of divine perfection. So 7, to some extent, through Revelation, we can find it to be like a perfect number, right? Even in creation onwards, we can find such an understanding. Now, over here, this sort of a thing, that we can find is kind of telling this does not fall, or this does not come closer to divine perfection. Every imitation of the emperor, every imitation of the beast is falling short and is not reaching the perfection. But what is happening is a triple intensification of human rebellion. People are going away because they've taken the mark of the beast and they've become the people of the beast than the people of God. They're now moving forward to a life that is of human rebellion. The enduring theological thrust is not speculative, but ethical and pastoral. Please understand, what we are called to do is not look at things and say, this is that, this is this. No, instead, we are called to understand that as people of God, we must resist compromise, whether through overt persecution or subtle economic and cultural pressures. That means whatever might come our way, we should not have an allegiance towards the beast. We should not compromise. Revelation insists on this choice, either loyalty to the Lamb or conformity to the beast. It's one of it. Either we are to the Lamb side or we are in the side of the beast. So that's why the persecution aspect that we can find over here, it situates present suffering within a larger eschatological assurance. Oppressive systems like Babylon will ultimately fall, while the faithful belonging to the coming new creation will stand. The call, therefore, is to discernment, endurance, and uncompromising fidelity grounded in the prior victory of Christ. So what we should do is to understand that we stand and we have to follow the Lord, and we have to continually keep that we are faithful towards our call as God's people. Don't become the people of the beast. Now, see, a lot of time when we think of beastly images, it scares us. But often, beastly images are more attractive in nature than the image of the Lamb. Because in the image of the Lamb, and in the people, and if we are the people of the Lamb, they're going through severe suffering. Whereas it looks like the people of the beast are thriving. And that's where this whole passage is kind of calling us to that loyalty. And that's where chapter 14 comes. A very interesting chapter. Now, see, a lot of time we only look at chapter 13, the so-called Antichrist and so on. Though the word Antichrist is not there in Revelation at all. It's only there in 1 John and 2 John, which talks about the ones who deny Christ and his true identity. So what can we find here then? The loyalty towards God's people, the loyalty of God's people is not represented by a numerical number, but it is marked by the loyalty that they are showing. Here is a numerical number that we can find, which is 144,000 people. But this is again a representative number. Different sect, different denomination, different organizations, different groups, even within Pentecostalisms, have tried to interpret 144,000 in different way. But the clearest interpretation to that is, these are the faithful people of God who did not take the mark of the beast, but then they took the Lord's name upon them. These are people who are called by God, and they clearly understand. You know, I preached a sermon on this passage a few years back, and I remember titling this as Saints Who Sing the Song of the Lord. Saints who sing the song of the Lord. They are not ready to march according to the ways of the world, but instead they want to march according to God's ways. They did not defile themselves in any of the worldly ways, but rather they now stand with God on Mount Zion, the place of God's promised restoration. Yes, they might have died, they might have been persecuted, they might have gone through severe difficulties, but then we can see that through them, there is a new song that is coming. In contrast to Babylon, which is a city of rebellion, the Zion is put out here, the city of God. So now, see, there are different imageries that we can find here. On one side, we can find the beast versus the lamb. On the other side, you can find Babylon versus Zion over here. The city of God versus Babylon. So what we can actually find here is to question the people on which side are they going to stand. And they are singing a victorious song, celebrating Israel's praise after the deliverance. These believers are described as redeemed, purchased by the Lamb. That means They are excluded from economic life under the beast. That means they might be starving in the power of the beast, but they are the ones who are truly bought and are secured by God. So even when they are persecuted, they are the ones who are actually secured by God's power. The image of purity and celibacy is symbolic. See, some people have claimed that this is talking about a particular group of ministers who don't marry, but rather, being unmarried saints of God, they have to, they have to live and become this 144,000. That's not what this is talking about. It's an imagery. Largely, if you connect it with the tribe, the 12 tribes, and you kind of calculate it, and to some extent we can get this number 144,000, kind of showcasing it with the understanding that it's talking about the faithful bride, the holy army that stands, who are not ready to bow down for the moral and spiritual corruption of the Babylon. They're not defiling themselves to the world, and they are not ready for undivided, they are not ready for any sort of a divided allegiance, but they are standing tall in their faith. Their character is marked by truthfulness, blamelessness, fulfilling prophetic hopes. In a world of deception, propaganda, they stand as people who speak the truth, the people of the Lamb. What appears, now these are people who are martyrs, what appears as a defeat or martyrdom is in fact the victory of God's people. The Lamb's followers conquer not by force, but by faithfulness, and their destiny on Zion assures that allegiance to Christ, costly as it is, leads to ultimate triumph. Now this will lead to the next section, which we can find as the one that is heavenly announcement, the 4 heavenly announcements as we can see it. Revelation 14, 6-13 resumes a cycle of judgment announcements after the 7th trumpet, framing the conflict of chapter 12, 13 with divine perspective. Now look at it. 3 angelic proclamations are following. In the first section, which is 6 and 7 verses, there is a universal warning. There is a warning that, for the whole world. It's telling that, and he had let me read chapter 14, verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in the mid-air, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. So there's a universal warning. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So here is a very clear declaration from the angel that the universal gospel is going to be preached. And what should be the response? Fear God and worship the Lord alone. On the other side, we can find 14:8. The second angel is declaring that fallen is Babylon the Great. The empire that thought that they can never fall is now falling. And then we can find the third angel in verse 9 is talking about the doom of the beast worshippers. Everybody who worship the beast will ultimately be judged, and they will have the punishment. And then in verse 12, what should people of God do? Now, if you actually follow from across, if you're following with me in the text, this word is going to be there again and again. Verse 12, this calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keeps his commandments. So what should God's people do? They should patiently endure the persecution. They should look forward and patiently understand that God is working. The declaration, fallen is Babylon, alludes to Isaiah 21:9 and functions as a reference to Rome at this point of time. Now, by now we have already understood any time the word Babylon is used, it's directly talking about Rome, like ancient Babylon. Rome intoxicates the nations with idolatry and injustice, but it will drink instead the wine of God's wrath, a common prophetic imagery. So the people who are leading them, the army of Rome, will be under God's wrath. Those who worship the beast face unmixed judgment. 49-11. Very clearly, the ones who are followers of the beast, they are going to suffer. The imagery of fire, sulfur, and unceasing smoke underscores the finality and seriousness of the divine judgment. That means that the suffering of God's people were temporary. But then we can find that the seriousness of the suffering, the judgment, is something that is very clearly written in Revelation. And this calls for patient endurance from God's people. When the wicked will have no rest, the faithful are called blessed. So what can we find here? A clear warning to the world. Judgment is coming. Assurance to the saints that Babylon will fall. It's a call to perseverance. We are called to endure faithfully. And ultimately, we are given the promise of rest. Death in the Lord is a victory, as we can see it. Present suffering is temporary. Divine judgment is certain. And ultimate rest belongs to those who remain in the Lord alone. In chapter 14, we can find that from there, it shifts from proclamation to symbolic action. So now it is not just from words, but like two harvest imageries that we can find over here. The figure like Son of Man is evoking Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, and is pointing to Christ Jesus. Now, the question here is there are two major interpretive or two major harvests that we can find here, grain and grapes. And the question is whether it is the same imagery. Now, already we have seen how certain things are repeated with a different example or with a different word. Like, for example, the trumpets and the bowls and the wrath and all of those, how the almost same things repeated again and again, just like how we're going to look at chapter 15 and 16. So what we can find here, some see the first as the gathering of the righteous and the second as the judgment of the wicked, nothing that believers are called first fruits. However, it is more likely that both images draws from Joel chapter 3 verse 13, depicting judgment, with the second, the winepress, intensifying the imagery. So it's not just one and the other, but rather it is one and then leading to an intensifying of the suffering, intensifying of the judgment, as we can see. The winepress vision is unmistakable. The wicked are crushed like grapes, producing a river of blood. Now, please don't take all this literally. This 1,600 stadia, and people think that there is going to be a river of blood and things like that. It's more of an imagery. It's trying to kind of resonate with us, to kind of say to us, using an apocalyptic language, that the judgment is going to be harsh. The judgment is going to come upon people who are the followers of the beast. Revelation applies this role to Christ, that divine judgment is executed through Christ. And we can find that there is a deliberate graphical imagery over here. The representation of how the blood of grapes imagery that we can find over here. What we can find here is that judgment is there for the wicked, as we can see it. So if you look into this, In the first section, which is 6 to 13, we can find the proclamation of the judgment, whereas in 14 to 20, we can find the execution of the judgment. Now, these are same things, but repeated, one through the verbal form, the other in the way of explanation as an imagery. People are able to find it. This leads us to chapter 15, which is now starting to talk about the bowls. Now, already we have seen the 3 sevens. Now, after the second 7, it took a break. It took a longer space to talk about different things. And then now we have come to the final 7, which is a 7 bowls of God's judgment. The bowls, like the seals and trumpets, are administered by angels. So it's a heavenly, angelic, divinely matter. John explicitly calls the vision a sign in heaven, emphasizing a symbolic portrayal. See, again, look at it. More than literal aspect to say this is that, this is this. It's more talking about a portrayal of judgment. That's why we said it's not one over the other. It's the same thing repeated in different ways. And this is the last plagues that completes God's anger. It does not necessarily imply strict chronological sequence. We have seen that across, right? In the bowls and the seals and trumpets, we have seen that. It is not necessarily chronological, but rather it is talking about the judgment of God. The Greek term phial, bowl is used for both wrath and for the prayers of the saints. The bowls contain incense symbolizing the intercession of the believers. Judgment emerges from God's presence in response to worship and prayer. See, every prayer of God's people, the suffering community is valued and they are taken up. And God values the prayers of his saints. And those who do harm, the wicked, are going to be judged. And that is what we can find here. The imagery may anticipate the final wine cup of divine wrath. And prayer becomes a very essential part of this setting. The victorious saints conquer through suffering and martyrdom. See, the same themes are repeating, isn't it? Chapter 13, we saw how the 144,000 who are unblemished and they are giving their lives as a martyr. And here again, the victorious saints are conquering through suffering and martyrdom. They are refusing to compromise with the agenda of the beast. The earthly defeat becomes spiritual triumph. They are corresponding to the 144,000 of Revelation 14. The sea of glass mixed with fire recalls the heavenly temple imagery. Now over here, there is a song of Moses, verse 3 onwards. Now, now these are the people of God who are singing these songs. And they're singing the song of the servant Moses and of the Lamb. The song unites the Old Testament redemption with final Christ work. We can find that just like how after crossing of the Red Sea, here are the people of God rejoicing. They are, cherishing. They are singing and dancing before God. Just like that, here are God's people singing this marvelous song, declaring that great and marvelous are your deeds. Lord God Almighty, just and true are your ways, King of the nations, who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name, for you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. See the rich theological song that the redeemed are singing. They're focusing on who God is, and they're singing this song. The secondary echoes from Deuteronomy 32. Jesus fulfills the typology of the Passover lamb. Jesus is now taking that position of the Passover lamb. We have already seen this from chapter 4, chapter 5, and so on. And Revelation portrays as a church as the people of the new Exodus. So here is just like the Israel were on that journey. Now church is on that new Exodus because God has redeemed them. Israel sang after deliverance from Egypt. The saints sing song after victory over the beast. The sea imagery recalls the Red Sea crossing. God's victory over Egypt foreshadows final victory over evil. The dragon imagery recalls the Old Testament chaos tradition, and the martyrs stand as conquerors on the heavenly sea. But what is the theology of the song? I'm more interested in that. The language is heavily from Psalms 86. God is praised for his great and marvelous deeds. The plagues themselves are presented as a righteous act of judgment. But God is just and true in his judgments. And judgment vindicates the blood of the saints. So we can find that here is a God who is a king of the nations, and everyone will ultimately fear the Lord. The nations will ultimately come to worship the Lord. Revelation is blending the themes of judgment and redemption over here. The turning of the nations is likely referring to a repentant remnant, the ones who are turning to God and are seeking for a repentance. Christ's kingdom extends across all the people. The nation is finally recognizing the falsehood of idols. The people are realizing where they have fallen and where they have become followers of the falsehood of the idols. And that's why we can find the heavenly judgment, the heavenly temple, verse 5 onwards of chapter 15. When John looked, I saw in heaven the temple, that is a tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was opened. Again, imagery. Later we find that there is no temple there. You don't need a temple. That's much later in chapter 21. Now, what we can find here is the bold judgments are introduced in the heavenly temple. Earthly disasters are portrayed as divinely ordered events. The angels are wearing priestly linen garments with golden breastplates. Judgment is presented as priestly liturgical action, and the heavenly temple corresponds to the suffering of the earthly church. What's happening here? We can find that the temple is filled with the smoke of the glory of God and the power of God. And no one can enter into the temple because it's filled with God's power. The smoke has filled the earth, filled the temple. And this is very much resembling Isaiah 6, Exodus 40, 1 Kings 8, in the inauguration of the temple, when nobody could enter into the temple because it was filled with the presence of God. The imagery communicates overwhelming divine majesty. And over here, we can see the judgment of God, but as well as the mercy of God upon God's people. God is responding to the worship of the martyred saints of God. The ones who have died in the Lord, they are singing the song of the Lord. And that is what we can find here. And this leads us to chapter 16, which are primarily talking about the bowls. And we can find that it's listed as plagues. A voice from the heavenly temple commissions the bowls. The bowls parallel and intensify the trumpet judgment. The plagues are recalling Exodus, sores, blood, darkness, and scorching heat. God protects his people as he protected Israel in Goshen. The final bowls move towards the climatic judgment. So we can find here the first 4 bowls. If you look at verse 2, the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the land. And ugly, festering sores broke out on the people who had the mark of the beast. The second angel, verse 3, it poured out on the bowl on the sea, and it turned into the blood like that of a dead person. The third angel, verse 4. So we can find that this is resembling to the plagues in Exodus narrative. Here is water turning into blood. It's a repeated emphasis. An angel over the waters praises God's justice. The judgment avenged the blood of the saints. The altar joins in affirming God's righteousness. The imagery is recalling. Obviously, anybody who hears this can think of the plagues that led Israel to be free from Egypt. Justice and holiness in God's judgment. Revelation 16, 5-7. The angel, then I heard the angel in charge of the waters say, here is the angel who is singing the song. Chapter 15, we saw the people who are redeemed sing the song. In chapter 16, we can find the angels singing, you are just in these judgments, O Holy One, you who are and who were. For they have shed the blood of your holy people and your prophets, and you have given them blood to drink as they deserve. God is recognized as holy God and righteous God because he judges justly. The wicked shed blood, therefore blood is given them to drink. Now, please, this imageries look terrifying. Not something that we can teach our children, before they go to sleep. It'll probably scare them. But what is it trying to say? Saying that the justice of God, the righteousness of God will have to bring forth the judgment of God. The judgment corresponds appropriately to human rebellion. The way how people have rebelled and turned themselves against God, there is going to be judgment upon them. The prayers of the martyrs are finally vindicated. The plagues of sun and darkness recalls again Exodus imagery. Darkness functions as judgment against false gods. The darkness is painful. It's not as easy as we think. Instead of repenting, now this is where we have seen this multiple times already in Revelation. Instead of repenting and turning to God, they are still rebelling. Their hearts have hardened and they are focusing on themselves. The wicked continue blaspheming God. The drying out of Euphrates, as we can see, prepares the way for invasion. Again, it recalls Isaiah 50 verse 2 and also Joshua's conquest traditions, how Joshua is called to wipe off everything from the land. Ancient readers associated the Euphrates with the Parthian invasions. The image heightens the terror of end-time judgment. God sovereignly prepares the nation for final judgment. And then we have the frog-like spirits. The dragon, beast, and false prophet form like a satanic parody of the Trinity. A frog-like spirit emerges from their mouth. And this kind of symbolizes a deceptive propaganda, a demonic influence that is over there. It recalls the Exodus plagues of frogs. False signs gather the nations against God, as we can find it. Revelation 16:15 interrupts the vision with a warning. Now, in between all of this, there is a warning that Jesus is saying, look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remain clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. See, even if you don't understand all the other things, as long as you understand this, it's good to go. Because this is the core of Revelation. Jesus is telling he is coming. And knowing to us when we don't know, unexpected. But we must remain awake and clothed. Not bearing shame, not being unprepared, but the church must persevere without any form of compromise. That's what we can find over here. In 16:6, we can find sorry, 1616 it is, not 16:6, 1616, we can find that then they gathered the kings together to the place that is in Hebrew called as the Armageddon. Armageddon likely means Mount Megiddo. And Megiddo was associated with various historical battles. It's like an end time conflicts. The gathering of the nations that is fulfilling the prophetic expectations. The nations gather unknowingly for their own destruction. Here are people, the wicked ones, the ones who are rebelling against God. They are gathering, again, symbolic in its language, gathering. Why? Because they're turning against God and they are turning against the people of God. And right after that is a seventh bowl. It is poured into the air, and the declaration it is done signals a completion. Thunder, lightning, earthquake recalls like a Sinai theophany. Here is the imagery of like God coming at Sinai. It symbolizes cosmic judgment and the end of the age. But ultimately, what does it say? It's about God's sovereignty alone. The great city that we can find in verse 19 onwards, which is obviously called there as Babylon, but we know it is to be the Rome. It will drink the cup of God's wrath, the one who has persecuted God's people, the one who has turned their face against God. They will truly drink the wrath of God. The imagery reflects the covenantal judgment against all forms of unfaithfulness. Babylon will ultimately fall. That's why we have in the last two verses the cosmic judgment. Mountains and islands will disappear before divine judgment. This is a very apocalyptic language. It's going to be a cosmic collapse. But wait, because after this, there are the new heavens and the new earth. Now, why are we learning this? We have learned about the the different sevens. And all these different sevens, we have seen how the call is not for speculations, not to look into it and try to say this is that, that is this is where, and all that, because that will only bring interpretation problems. But then why is this written? This is written so that God's people can safeguard themselves. This is written so that God's people know where to stand, not to bear the mark of the beast, but to be part of the 144,000 who will not compromise even in the midst of threats of death.